These are Baba's words about harmony. And he made these words in the Nasik ashram in 1937. He said, "I do not mind crises. I do not mind chaos, but I do mind disharmony. I tolerate everything. Be tolerant with everyone, and when you feel like rising up into fury and having an argument with your adversary, say, I am here for Baba, and Baba wants above all else harmony. Harmony is the basis of life, living in a group, working for and living with me and helping me in my work." So the talk I'm going to share with you today is a talk I've given a number of times. It's based on an article that I had published in the Glow in the fall of 2012. And it came out of a lot of work that I had done with different Baba groups. And I'm going to share a little bit of that work with you. My own journey in this has been, it's been a very full journey. As many of you know, I'm an organizational change consultant. That's what I do for a living. Been doing it for about 45 years now. I work with all kinds of organizations, doing all kinds of work, and all the work is on one level about change. It is all about change. And through this work, and these are the kinds of things that I do with organizations. I help create shared vision, shared strategy, work on organizational and governance structures, conflict resolution, team building, community building, culture change, leadership development. And I also do a fair amount of work in the area of what would be called large group and citizen engagement on public policy issues. That's the field that I'm in of work. But over time, I started being asked to do work with Baba groups, doing some similar kinds of work. And I think we know that Baba actually encouraged people to belong to groups. And this is what Baba said in Myrtle Beach in '56. He said, "I would like you all to belong to certain groups. Why? Because you can cooperate and tell others about me and share your thoughts. You learn much more than when you remain by yourself." And I take this to mean on two levels, at least. One level is we can learn about Baba's life and message. I mean, we can share all of that and how to interpret it or how to understand it. But we can also learn by putting into practice many of the things that Baba taught, and especially about harmony. In Nasik, Baba, as we know, Baba was very concerned about the lack of harmony amongst the folks there, especially the Westerners, and to the point to which he threatened to dissolve the ashram and send them all back. And he said, unless they could learn to live in harmony, and he said, I can give you many, many things, but one thing I can't give you is harmony. That's something you have to do yourselves, and that is in essence the work he gave us. So on one level, when he talks about the importance of groups, I take it to mean it's important to work in groups to learn how to live and work in harmony with one another. So as I said, I've been working with different Baba groups over the last almost 20 years now. And these are the groups I've done work with, fairly extensive work with the center, the LA Center, the Northern California Center, the Heartland Center in Prague, Oklahoma, where Baba had his accident. There's a group called Beads on One String that Don Stevens was instrumental in starting, Mayorana in Mariposa, California, and the Avatar Mayor Baba Trust that you've heard that work here. And the kinds of things that they've asked for have been the kinds of things that other groups have asked for. It's not different kinds of things that people feel the need for. They want vision, strategy, and so on. Same kinds of stuff. Now, in addition, and as I shared yesterday, those of you who were here, I also have my own experience being in groups. I was involved with the Mayor Baba Washington gathering starting in 1976, and through much of the 1990s, and had an opportunity to provide leadership there and participate in those kinds of group activities. So I had a lot of experience about kind of what was it like, not just to help consult to groups or facilitate them, but actually to be in them and work with them. And now, of course, I'm on the board of directors of the Mayor Center, and that's its own process. And I just say, it's all a learning process for me. What I'm presenting you is not a fait accompli at a personal level. this is sort of my own, my own ongoing work. There's a saying that we teach what we need to learn. And I would certainly identify with that here, that I know from my own personal family situation and so on, there was a lot of learning I had to do about how to work with and be with groups of people. And I think it's our family experiences that really form much of the foundation for how we come into groups beyond our families. But I want to share a few things, and I want to do this in the spirit of this entire presentation is my assimilation and my synthesis about these experiences I've had and how I've tried to make meaning out of them. So I really offer to you in that spirit, and I'm going to share it with you, walk you through the whole thing. And again, as I did the other day, ask you to hold your comments if you would. I'm going to try to make sure there's time at the end for some comments about this, because I think what I'm presenting here is probably going to may well stimulate some thoughts and reactions and so on. And I absolutely want to hear them, but I want you to hear the whole presentation before, so we don't sort of lose the thread on it. So some of my observations that I've made in working with and being part of Baba groups are that when I am, this is in working with Baba groups, that when groups come to me, they are often coming at a time when they're looking to grow and expand, like the trust. That's when they came to me. But very often the requests also come out of a period of crisis or stagnation. That's also true, and that's true in my private professional practice. It's true with Baba groups too. And when I think about it, on one level or another, almost every request that I make comes out of some seeking for harmony. Whether it's to harmonize interpersonal relations, to harmonize vision and strategy, collective efforts, whatever it is, that harmony is really at the root of a lot of what I do. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my observation about Meher Baba groups over time. And again, this is very particular to my experience, so it doesn't necessarily, I'm not trying to imply that this may match your experience, you can decide for yourself. But I can say one of my observations is the high level of commitment and dedication that people in Baba groups have to Baba. And it's very striking to me. I've looked at and been associated with and seen many, many other kinds of groups and spiritual groups and so on. And what I've noticed in the Baba group, as I've been here, the number of people I've talked to who came to Baba in 1969, and here it is over 50 years later, like that, or came earlier than 1969, is really extraordinary. And it's really, I don't take that for granted at all. That's not my experience widely common like that. But that's been true with Baba groups, and it's really, really very striking to me about that. But I also want to make a couple of observations about Baba groups, because this is also true, is that I do experience, and I experienced in Washington, that there was a kind of a period of initial enthusiasm about being in a group, but it was followed over time by watching interest in the group waning, or very few new people being drawn in and coming in. I found that there were periods of prolonged conflict that would go unresolved and unaddressed. And frankly, and again, I don't want to sound judgmental, but experiences and observations of behavior that seemed kind of contrary to what I thought Baba was asking of us in terms of kind of the loving nature and the cooperative nature of what he talked about. And those are just my observations. And again, this is not about Avatars Abode or anything. This is about my experiences in Washington and many of the groups that asked me to come in there. One such group was the Meher Center staff. I think I did 7 team building sessions with the Meher Center staff over time. And when they were working out their agreements about how they were going to work together, this was their statement about harmony. This is their agreeing harmony. You got a problem with that? And it kind of captured the feeling about kind of how things had evolved there. And while it's humorous, there's an underlying reality to that. So Baba made a statement. He wants harmony. But he said, I don't mind conflict and I don't mind chaos. That's what he said. I just read those words to you. So a central question I think we have to address is, how do we embrace crisis and chaos as in our efforts to achieve harmony? How do we encompass all of that together and not try to exclude one from the other, but to really understand that conflict and chaos are really part of harmony. And related to that question is the question of, is there a method or is there discipline that we can follow that can help create that harmony? And that's what I want to share with you is kind of my own response to those two questions. What I'm about to share with you is it's a framework of understanding how groups mature and develop harmony and create what I call real harmony. And you'll see why I use that term here. It's not completely original work, and I really want to be clear about that. There are two major sources I've used with this work. One, some of you may have read it. There's an author named M. Scott Peck, no longer alive, but he wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled, one of the most widely known sort of psycho-spiritual books that's been written. And but he also wrote a book on community building called A Different Drum. And in it, many of the ideas I have here are really derived from and extend from his ideas. And then also there's a man named Paul Werder, who is a friend and colleague of mine. I spent a number of years studying healing from a Sufi perspective, and Paul was one of the people that was teaching in that program. He wrote a book called Building Unity, which also uses a very similar model. And so I just want to acknowledge that these are works that I've taken and I've really tried to put in the context of Baba's own words and own teachings and my own experience with Baba. And what I'm going to share with you are what I believe are 5 phases that groups naturally go through in their efforts to achieve what I call real harmony. So we're going to walk through them. And the first phase I call called pseudo harmony. And I love this picture because I think it sort of captures kind of the essence of kind of what it's like. There's a kind of a frozen quality to these figures that are relating to one another, and I think that that's fair. This is what Baba said in the book Beams. He said, all search is a struggle to arise from the false to the real. Further, the false cannot eternally take its stand upon the false and patently and wantingly cling to itself and remain itself endlessly. So, what is pseudo-harmony? It's an attempt to preserve a sense of harmony in a group in spite of feeling underlying differences and conflicts. It's trying to hold on to that sort of sense of, and it often feels like niceness and politeness, and it's a kind of a sheen over a group like that. And it's the means by which this happens in this group, this is kind of social psychology, those of you who have studied that, is through the establishment of norms. Norms are sort of patterns of behavior, and they're usually unconscious. They're usually not spoken, they're not articulated, but somehow you walk into a group and you pick them up, you kind of read them, and you kind of know what the rules of the road are for that particular group. That's what norms are. And there's the kind of norms I was observing in Baba groups was an unspoken expectation of kind of, don't we all feel this way about Baba or about the Mandali or about whatever it is, that there's an expectation that we all sort of feel this, feel similarly. Also, in pseudo-harmony, there is a felt limitation to express or work through conflict. That it's sort of a conflict avoidance tends to be the characteristic of states of pseudo-harmony. And there also is very often kind of boundaries about how much you can disclose about yourself personally. That there's sort of, I can tell you this part of myself, but I can't tell you about this part of myself, like that. And so there's, the field of interaction is sort of, it narrows in that phase. There's also very often a hierarchy of authority. And again, it may be spoken, it may be unspoken, but you kind of know who's up and who's down. And that's also differences in status and prestige. Who's important, who's not as important. This is all pseudo-harmony, like that. And I make it sound like pseudo-harmony is a bad thing, right? But actually, it's not unimportant. And it actually, I've seen groups that actually move through pseudo-harmony too fast. Because pseudo-harmony does begin to establish a sense of belonging and safety in a group. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to start out by being polite. and by being sort of nice to each other. It's, again, it's a natural human phenomenon. However, it also does bring with it very often a sense of inauthenticity for people, and a sense of people can feel oppressed when they're in a state of pseudo harmony. And there can also be that individually a feeling of kind of almost a personal sense of self-betrayal by trading one's own sense of genuineness for a sense of inclusion in the group, like that. And so it brings with it its own natural need to resolve itself. Now, if it persists and it doesn't resolve itself in a group, what I've seen is that there's withdrawal. People stop coming to groups, or when they come, they don't really invest themselves as much in the groups, like that. That's all kind of withdrawal. Or they mask. They put on a mask when they walk in, and they take it off, and they're relieved when they walk out of the room. And I've had that personal experience also in some groups that I've been with, where I felt like I had to sort of be like this there. And when I walked out the door, phew, it was like, thank God I can go have a drink with somebody and, let my hair down a little bit, like that. And also abandonment, just kind of leaving, like that. That's what happens if pseudo harmony persists. But eventually the pressure builds up with pseudo harmony. And if it's allowed to go on, there is this felt need, like we can't keep doing it this way, and eventually there needs to be something that resolves it. So the question is, what will it take to resolve pseudo harmony and move to the next phase? And the answer is risk-taking. That's putting on the table, something, I know that it seems like everybody feels this way about this, about whatever. I actually feel differently about it. I don't feel this. Or, something, I'm not quite so comfortable with the way that decisions get made in this group, or I like that. That all goes against norms. And when I talk about risk-taking, the risk is you're going to be excluded or you're going to be disapproved of and so on. That's why it's called risk-taking. But it takes risks to move beyond pseudo-harmony, to sort of put on the table where there is not comfort with or acceptance of some of the established norms. And when that happens, it leads to the second phase, which is chaos. Now, chaos sounds like a bad thing, but chaos is actually, I should say, it's in my world, it's not understood to be a bad thing. It's understood to be a very, have with it potential, creative potential. I love this quote from Rilke, who says, "Man cannot discover new oceans unless he has the courage to lose sight of the shore." I find this just an enormously relevant and inspiring quote. So what is chaos? It's the confrontation of differences and the surfacing of conflicts and the exploration of those conflicts. That's what the phase of chaos really is about. And the differences can be things like people not being comfortable with the mission or the purpose of the group. Say, I don't think we're doing the right thing here. I don't think we're focused on what's really most important here, or I disagree with this focus. It may be, I don't like the group's activities. Why do we have to have 2 Sahavas a year? What do we get out of those, or whatever it is? It could be questioning the norms of interaction. I notice that when this person speaks, everyone listens, but when this person speaks, nobody listens, that kind of thing. It could be raising concerns about leadership and authority in the group. Like, again, I'm not comfortable. I'm being excluded from decisions, or I don't feel these decisions are being made in the proper way, or challenging the status and prestige of members, like that. These are all this is not an exhaustive list. This is simply kind of a range of things that could be, kinds of differences that can arise. There are probably others that we could think of. But how we handle conflicts and disagreements. So chaos is about the raising of these. Now, it can be very productive and creative to handle them, or it cannot be productive and creative, and even damaging, because the way we handle them makes a difference. And there are 2 primary ways in which conflicts and disagreements get handled. And I'm going to call them violent communication and nonviolent communication. Now, violent doesn't mean like the rugby game that I saw last night, but it does mean, like Erich would say, we should never harm the heart of another person. Well, a violent communication harms the heart of another person, whether it's intended to or not. It does. That's what's violent about it. Nonviolent communication doesn't do that. So violent communication is things, these are examples, and this is a pretty good list, I think. Personal attacks. And these can be subtle, they can be explicit, they can be very subtle and nuanced. Like I've seen a lot of times people say, I wasn't attacking you. I said, well, it certainly, I felt the sword come in, like that. It can be shaming people. It can be intimidating people. It can be making assumptions about people's motives or attributing motives to people, like that. Manipulation, and very closely related to that, is politicking and building of alliances. So when you walk into a meeting, the decision's already been made because 4 people have gotten together and said, we're gonna be shoulder to shoulder on this, and we're not gonna sort of have any daylight between us when we have the discussion. That's all what I would call violent behavior. And it very often has the impact of wounding other people, like that. Nonviolent communication, some of you may have been exposed to this or trained in it. I find more and more people are very aware. How many of you are aware of nonviolent communication? So quite a few of you are. There's a book by a man named Marshall Rosenberg that's called Nonviolent Communication. It's a really good book. If you're interested in this, I recommend it. But it's communication that demonstrates respect for both self and other. And it's things like sharing your personal experiences through I messages. When you said this, this is how I felt. So it's not saying you did this, but when you said that, this is the feeling that was evoked in me. It's seeking understanding. So I don't quite understand what your point was when you said that. Can you say more about that? Active listening. Active listening is very often reflective listening. It's sort of saying, okay, let me make sure I understand what you said. What I heard you say was like that. Creating safety and so, giving people encouragement that supports honest expressions, even if you don't like it or don't agree with it. Acknowledging the existence of multiple realities and legitimizing it. Something I think we may really, we may be seeing this differently. We may have a different point of, we really may have some honest differences here. And showing empathy, showing that you care, gee, I'm really concerned that you may have felt, slighted by what happened, like that. That's all in the realm of nonviolent communication. I don't really like the term nonviolent communication, I should say, because I don't like terms that they're stated in what they aren't, as opposed to what they are. But because it's such a term of art, I'm going to stick with it for the moment. And I would say that one of the core issues that if we're to get through chaos, it's very critical that we move past an insistence on being right to a search for the truth, and allowing the possibility the truth may be bigger than what we believe, what we perceive, what we think, like that. And that's a critical condition for getting through chaos. And if it's handled successfully, if it's not handled successfully, because chaos is essentially about conflict. Like Baba talked about chaos and conflict. This is chaos and conflict. This is how chaos and conflict comes into the creation of harmony, that we get locked into conflict. We have politicking, and do you all know what triangulation is? It's when I go to this person to complain about that person. And it's considered in like family systems theory and things like that to be one of the most, if not the most damaging dynamic that occurs in groups. And if we find, some people will call it gossiping. And it's really or backbiting. It's so inherent in kind of damaging the fabric of group relations. If it's not handled successfully, again, in chaos, just like in the other ones, withdrawal and abandonment can happen. People can just say, this is too much in this group. I don't want to put up with this. This is just a drag to be here. Or, frankly, some groups will retreat back to pseudo harmony. Look, this isn't very much fun. Let's be nice to each other. And it doesn't resolve the issue. It's sort of saying, we can't deal with it. And that's the dilemma with that. But if it's handled successfully, at the end of the phase of chaos, we start to really understand each other's perspectives and realities and feelings. And we start to understand we live in a world of multiple realities. And I don't mean this, writ large. I'm talking about this is maybe on an issue by issue basis. Maybe, today we're talking about what we should do about next year's Sahavas, or we may be talking about, how we're going to get the lawn, the lawn mowing, whatever the topic is. But we understand we have different realities about that issue. It doesn't mean that we've reconciled them. all it means is we've understood them. And once we really have that understanding and accepting, we accept we have different realities, then we move into the third phase, which is the phase that is called emptiness. And emptiness, I love this picture here, and this is the quote I have for it. It's from Rumi. It says, "Jump off the boat and submerge yourself in my fine waters." It's a little emptiness there. Emptiness is when we've suspended our assumptions, beliefs, and perceptions to give space for a new reality to emerge. And the experience of emptiness is void. It could be ambiguity, lack of definition, and spaciousness. That's what it's like. I'm intrigued by the word void. I did a lot of study and teaching of Gestalt psychology. And there's a concept in Gestalt called the fertile void. And the idea is that all creativity comes out of a void. It comes out of creating emptiness first, and out of empty. And artists, I think, know this. And people that are in creative processes of any sort know this. That I think, and certainly my experience is, I have to create sort of a not knowing place, and and it's out of the not knowing place that something genuinely new can happen and new can emerge. And so I think the word avoid, if you think about it just etymologically, it's a, which means without, void. A void means without the void, right? And if you're going to go to emptiness, you have to tolerate the void. You have to tolerate gee, we don't really know what the solution is here. We just have that space. And there's some things that help us be in a state of emptiness. For one thing, allowing some silence or space or time. I mean, a lot of times, just naturally, groups will say, let's sleep on it, or let's take a break, or let's just sit in silence for a while and just be together like that. Can be extremely helpful when dealing with, particularly in a loaded situation where there's a lot of emotion to it, to let things settle some. Suspending fixed beliefs and assumptions, obviously at a personal level, is very helpful. Non-reactivity. I know that, by the way, everything I'm saying here about creating harmony applies in any relationship. It applies in a marriage relationship, a group relationship, a community relationship. I've seen it in all. I know that my wife Carol and I go through a process sometimes when we're having issues between us it's called imago, which is very much it's an active listening process, but it really requires this is disciplined work. Let me just say that at the outset. This is not easy and not necessarily come immediately naturally. You have to practice this stuff, and it takes self-control. Baba said, Baba placed a tremendous amount of emphasis just to say on self-control. To do this stuff takes self-control, and it takes real discipline not to react, not to jump in, not to kind of give, here's my opinion about that, that kind of stuff, but to really allow space for things. Breathing is extremely helpful, just to say. I mean, it's helpful just to get oxygen into our blood, but it's also extremely helpful to avoid reactivity and just having a practice of just breathing like that. Exploring differences is where very helpful to say, I don't quite understand your point of view. Let me really understand it, and let me make sure I've expressed my point of view in a way that you can understand like that. And the last one I want to dilate on a little bit is called dialogue. Dialogue is a generic term. I mean, I think we use it very, and many of us use it like, let's have a dialogue about this and that. But it's actually a practice, and it's a practice that's gained a lot of traction since the 1990s. There's been a lot of exploration of it, and there's a lot of application of it in all kinds of settings now. It's used a lot in interfaith work or religious work. It's used in organizations and corporations and citizen and community engagement work. And it's actually been the subject of a lot of study including a guy named David Bohm, who's a theoretical physicist who studied kind of what is dialogue. And it's a conversation among people with different views on a topic of importance where the intention isn't to convince people, and the intention isn't to fix something, but it's to learn and to grow. That's why you do dialogue. And these are some of the principles of dialogue. I'm not spending a lot of time on it, but I wanted to add this. It's not in my article. I added this for this presentation because I just think it's extremely helpful when groups learn and agree on the practice of dialogue to practice it. And again, you can see the principles that the intent is to learn about one another's realities, honesty, sincerity, listening for meaning is extremely important, suspending assumptions, speaking from one's own experience using I messages, and fundamentally allowing oneself to be influenced by what one hears. Susan Sarandon, who's, somebody told me this just the other day, it was interesting. Somebody asked Susan Sarandon what she thinks of listening is. She's a very well-known actress. You may know of her in some of her many roles. And she said, to listen is to change. I thought that was a very wonderful definition of the word listen, is to really allow ourselves to be molded, not to say that we're just putty in other people's, but to allow ourselves to be impacted by what we hear. Now, if emptiness is not resolved, and we're in that state, we reassert and rigidify our prior beliefs, and we just go back to going, no, I don't agree with them like that. And we can revert back to chaos, or even back to pseudo harmony at that point in time. And again, if it's not resolved in a group, again, sometimes people just say, I don't want to be part of this. Enough. It's too much trouble. But if it's allowed, it leads to another phase called attunement. And this is not in Scott Peck's work. This is I provided this. And this is what Baba said. I will teach you how to move in the world, yet be at all times in inward communion with me as the infinite being. So attunement is feeling into what what Baba calls the voice of inspiration, of intuition, of guidance. But it's done at a group level. It's not done just at the individual level. It's done at a group level. That's how I define attunement in the Real Harmony approach. And it can help clarify whatever it is we tune ourselves to. But it's asking Baba for guidance, or asking Baba for inspiration or intuition about an issue, a dynamic that we're wrestling with, a decision we have to make, a course of action we want to pursue, or a perspective that we want to have. And ultimately, for me, it's about attuning to what is Baba's wish for us in the group. And this is at a group level again. I mean, this is true at an individual level, no question about it. But I'm talking at a group level for Baba's wish for the group in addressing the issue it's facing. So this is an example. I'm not trying to be prescriptive here, but it's an example of a group attunement process that I've used a number of times. And you could use it or adapt it if you wanted. Where a group that is ready to go into a phase of attunement, first of all, to clearly articulate what's the essential choice point that we're trying to figure out. Like, I did this once with a group where we were trying to figure out whether to allow a certain person who had been very disruptive to come into one of our retreat gatherings. That's an example of that one. I've also done it with a group where there was a very huge conflict in that group about what to do about a particular member who had, where there was a perception that somebody had violated some core tenet of the group, and what was the group going to do in response to that? These are examples of things, but it could be anything. And then once we're clear about that, to collectively enter a period of remembrance and say, let's just go into remembrance being remembrance of Baba. And however people want to do that, but I think of it as going into one's heart and remembering Baba, and then holding the focus over the question. So, asking Baba, what are you asking of us with regard to this question that we're wrestling with? And then having allowed that sufficient time, whatever that is, then asking everybody in the group to share, what did you get? How did what came up for you around that? And really giving space for everybody to share that and see whether or not some kind of group consensus begins to emerge out of that. And the times I've done this, it has emerged. So there's no guarantees, of course, about this, but that's been my experience. And then once that happens, then to, in some way or another, acknowledge, give gratitude to Baba, either individually or collectively, for the guidance that's been received. Now, this is simply a process that I offer you as an example. You can have your own. But I want to speak a little bit about what it means to listen to one's heart in a process like this, because it's not as, and maybe you all are already there, but this is something that, again, I got out of a lot of my work in the Sufi healing realm that helped me clarify this for myself about what does it mean to tune in to Baba's wish. And within the Sufis, there's 4 different layers of the heart that they speak to. The first is the layer of thought, and that's sort of all the chatter of the mind layer, and we all know about that, the monkey mind stuff, about kind of here's what this person's a jerk, or this person's this, or this, whatever we think. That's the first layer of the heart. And sometimes in Islam, that's called the nafs, N-A-F-S. And actually, in Islam, everything is nafs, but because it's almost like sanskaras. But just for this purpose, that's what they would call it. The second layer are the emotions that arise in response to the thoughts. Whether it's anger, sadness, fear, anxiety, whatever it is. That's the second layer of the heart. The third layer of the heart is actually begins to turn toward God, to actually seek inspiration. That's where it occurs, according to the Sufis, and they call this the deep heart. And actually, the Arabic word for heart that is used is a word that means that which turns, which is a really interesting notion. That, in other words, the heart can be turned toward the world and just be reactive, or it can turn to God and be inspired. And it go either way. That's the nature of the heart from a Sufi perspective. But from that perspective, this is the only layer that you want to be in if you're going to ask for guidance. So if you're going to go back to this attunement process, here, a period of remembrance of the beloved, that you want to at least be in your third layer. And I'm not going to speak about the fourth layer. I know what the Sufis say about it, and I think with Baba, I view it a little bit differently, but it's beyond, Baba talks about intuition and then inspiration and illumination and so on. So beyond the third layer is you get into those other dimensions. So when I talk about attunement at a group level, what you have to do there is have a sense of safety for people to feel like this is an open field at this stage to see what emerges. And then a capacity on people's parts to tune into these deeper layers of the heart. There has to be trust and mutual respect. So when people share, they feel safe enough, and there's trust that people are sharing genuinely. An acknowledgement that no one owns the whole truth. It's like the blind man and the elephant. Like everybody's got a piece of the action there, and no one's got everything. And it's also a commitment to follow what is generated like that. And I found that these to be really essential conditions for, in my own life, and my own work with groups for this to work. And when I've done this kind of work, there's been a surprising amount of convergence when people actually do tune into the heart, because all of our hearts are connected; they're all the same, and so it's not like we're all sort of, we think of ourselves as different. I think at some level, but at another level, we actually are all the same. And when we really tune in, I think it's remarkable how we, can come up with very similar kinds of conclusions there. So that's attunement. And if attunement is successful, then we get to real harmony. And that's the fulfillment of those efforts. And that's why, harmony doesn't just happen. It's a process to get there if it's real harmony, as opposed to just the appearance of harmony, like that. And this is from Baba at the East-West Gathering. True children of one Father do not greet one another with smiles and embraces, and at the same time harbor grudges and ill feelings, but they have an active concern in their hearts for the well-being of one another and make sacrifices for that well-being. If you make me your real father, all differences and contentions between you, and all personal problems in connection with your lives will become dissolved in the ocean of my love. So, and this is, once we have real harmony in a group, this is like, how do you know if you have it? And these are sort of guideposts, that there's a sense of authenticity, inclusivity, listening, respect, empathy, honesty, creativity, compassion, acknowledgement and appreciation, forgiveness, and surrender. These are all the qualities that I associate with real harmony in a group. So those are your 5 phases of harmony. Now, I want to offer you 3 additional perspectives about all of this, because I think that they're all really important. The first is what I call the role of self-responsibility in groups. This is from Baba in Listen Humanity. Here is the real task of the aspirant, to pierce through his own layers of self-imposed self-sufficiency and insensitivity, so that he may expose a layer of vital awareness to the world about him, which would teach him if it could. So what is self-responsibility? I define it as the ability to participate in a group in an honest, respectful, and constructive way. But I think if we are being self-responsible in groups, that's what it entails. But there are barriers to our being able to do this, I think, and the major one that I think is emotional wounds. I think this is really what gets in the way when people really have a hard time being a productive, constructive, positive presence in a group. And how do we know if we're operating out of emotional wounds? Because it's not like it's not like the blood that's coming down Merwan's head onto his shirt. It's very often hidden even to us. Other people may sense it, but we don't know it. But these are some things that I think can be clues. There's certain clues I know for myself. Is strong reactivity is a clue. Like overreaction would be the term for it. A disproportionate feelings of anger, fear, sadness. In other words, being triggered like that. Excessive withdrawal. People are just, holding themselves back. It's very often out of woundedness. Fixed, rigid opinions in spite of evidence to the contrary. Like that. People that are just holding fast to this is the way it is no matter what you say and what evidence you're giving like that. The habitual creation of unnecessary conflicts and disagreements is a good indicator. Backbiting. I really have come to understand that backbiting is largely a function of wounds in myself. My backbiting is when I feel wounded, I feel triggered like that, that's when I find myself doing backbiting. And Baba, of course, said it was one of the major barriers. In fact, it's included in the prayer of repentance as backbiting. It's quite extraordinary. And triangulating, that's gossiping, and politicking, which is kind of building alliances. Those are all potential, I'm not saying they are, but they're things that I look at to say for myself, if these things are happening in me and I'm finding myself doing this kind of stuff, there's something going on in me that I need to address. So that's the list. And what's required when we find we're operating out of emotional wounds are, first of all, manage our behavior. Because just because we feel the wound doesn't mean we have to act out of it. There is such a thing as self-control. There is such a thing as, okay, let me really set that aside and really try to get beyond it. That's sort of a self-responsible thing to do. And if it's a serious wound and it's continuous, then get healing for it. To be honest with you, and I really be very blunt about it, that it's I've seen a lot of really, really difficult stuff going on from, where there's a real need for people to sort of say, okay, let me take some time out from this and let me get some help with this because I'm obviously not getting to it myself. And Baba talked about what's required for healing. He said in the discourses, modern psychology has done much to reveal the sources of conflict, but it has yet to discover methods of awakening inspiration or supplying the mind with something which makes life worth living. Well, he gave those discourses in 1938, and I would suggest that there's been a lot of evolution of psychology and an integration of more psycho-spiritual kinds of concepts since then. And actually, psychology, there is within the realm of sort of healing today, there are methods and their approaches and their ideas that really do help integrate the kind of psychological and the spiritual in a way where there is the availability of at least bringing in the elements of inspiration into one's personal healing. And basically what's required of healing is to surface the samskaric pattern that's at the root of the conflict. And Baba, one of the great gifts that Baba has given us is an understanding about samskaras and how they're basically the whole driver of our behavior. So to surface the root of that and then to transform it through some kind of spiritual awakening process. And it can be done directly with Baba. Just to say, I'm not saying, going to Baba and having it, giving it to him, if we're capable of doing that or getting help with it. So I want to now address what is required to create real harmony. This is a statement by Baba. True happiness begins when a man learns the art of right adjustment to other persons, and right adjustment involves self-forgetfulness and love. So to create real harmony for the individual, first of all, a commitment to do it, and a forbearance to stick with it. Because again, these are practices, these are disciplines. This is not just a one-time deal. This is ongoing. An honesty and a willingness to face oneself fully. Accepting that we are each responsible for operating in a healthy, responsible manner. Being forgiving, because obviously, there are lapses. I have lapses. Probably you have lapses. I'm not saying you do, but you might. And being willing to forgive yourself and forgive other people. Say, yeah, it was a lapse, but we can recover from it. We can move on. Cultivation of an open heart. And again, in keeping with what I said earlier, a capacity to attune to those deeper layers of the heart. And a commitment that once we hear Baba's voice and wish, we're committed to follow it. We don't just sort of take it as a second opinion. We sort of, see it, we take it for what it is. So those are things that I have found are really helpful for individuals if there's a seriousness about creating real harmony. And at a group level, there are some things that I think can be done. First of all, a commitment to make real harmony a priority, to really be very clear within a group, not just at a sort of surface level, but say, we are really committed to doing this, and we're going to do what it takes to get there. And what it takes may be a lot more than we think at times, but we're going to actually commit to doing it. Secondly, I think it's helpful for a group to understand that if we're going to get there, we're going to go through different phases. And you may not want to use the phases I have, but to understand it doesn't happen like this. It happens through a process. And we have to be committed to working through that process and not just sort of abandoning it just when we don't get the immediate results we want. A recognition that real harmony is an ongoing process. Those are three mindsets. And then there's some tools that I think are very helpful for groups. One, and this may be one of the most important ones, is the establishment of explicit norms that foster healthy experiences. And to really, I know in the board of directors of the center, we've spent hours and hours articulating our norms and revisiting them to be clear about what they are and to be really holding ourselves accountable to those norms. And when there are lapses in them, to coming back and addressing the lapses so we really don't stray from them. Secondly, some groups have adopted a conflict resolution process, where there's, if you're in a conflict, you can ask somebody else to help mediate the conflict, things like that. There are models out there of that, and some Baba groups have done that. Some groups do training for group members in nonviolent communication. This is really helpful training. Reading a book is a good thing, but it doesn't actually, for many of us, it's not enough to actually develop the skills. So getting some actual training in it. And there are plenty of people around that do it, that people have been through it and can offer training. And I'm not talking, there probably maybe people here who've been through it and could run a training session in it. And then, using facilitators who are skillful in creating safe space and enabling a group to move through the phases of harmony. Because when you're in the middle of it, it's kind of hard. It's like there's a phrase we have in Myrtle Beach that you guys could adapt here in Australia that let's see, when you're up to your neck in alligators, you can forget that your objective was to clear the swamp. Right, so just substitute crocodiles, and I think you've Australianized the idea. But it can be very hard to stay with it when you're in it, like that. And a facilitator doesn't have to be another member, outside person. It can be somebody in the group who says, for this, I'm willing to facilitate this. Now, another perspective I want to give is about, we live in a post-Mondale world. And I think that has implications. I've been working on an article or a book about this. I don't know. I've let it go for a little while, but I hope to come back to it. These, of course, are dear Mondale, and there's Francis there, of course, and Kitty down here, and Elizabeth from the Mayor's Center, and they're all gone. We had the privilege and the honor of, for many of us, knowing these people, interacting with them, being shaped by our experiences with them, but they're not with us anymore. And, therefore, whatever external authority they represented is no longer there. And that shifts the responsibility about where do we find guidance? Where do we find, someone to tell us what's real, what's not real, what's true, what's valid, what's important, like that. And I'm not saying that people here hadn't matured past that point when the Mondale were present. But I think that it's fair to say that for many of us that they played that role in many of our lives. They were like parents, like that, and now they're no more. And now we are those of us who are left. We're the ones who have that responsibility. So the question is how to thrive in a post-Mondale world. And a friend of mine, some of you know Dick Anthony, his social psychologist from Northern California, was talking with Erich about this once. And he said to Erich, when the avatar comes, there's an atmosphere around him when he's physically present. We heard wonderful stories from Merwan about that in these past couple of days. And so we know that atmosphere. And then Dick said to Erich, after the avatar drops his body, then there's this second period when the direct disciples, the Mondale, are present. And that has its own atmosphere and its own presence like that. But he said to Erich, at some point, all of you guys are going to be gone. And then what happens then? How do we keep it alive? Because in the past, that third period has been when things deteriorated. That's been when things sort of went downhill and things lost their way, and factionalization occurred, and rigidification and all that kind of stuff. So he said to Erich, how do we deal with that? And Erich, he said to me that Erich got very severe with him. And he said to Dick, he said, Baba was very adamant that not be allowed to happen in his advent. And so Dick said, okay, but how do we keep it from happening? And Dick said this to me, and I verified this. It's a very unusual statement by Erich. He said, the way you prevent that is to gather in small groups to share your mystical experiences with one another. Now, when I heard that from Dick, I was really quite shocked, because I've never heard Erich use the word mystical experiences in that context before. But I pressed Dick as hard as I could, and he was definite about that. He said that is exactly what Erich said. So, I just offer you that, and there's a relationship, I feel, between that statement and everything we're talking about harmony, where it's on us to create that harmony. And it's that sharing, of our deep selves with one another is part of the clue about how we're going to be able to do this, and how we're going to move into this, we're already in it, but move through this post-Mondale world the way that Baba would have wanted us to, at least. And I'm giving you my opinion about this, of course. So, so just to say that achieving real harmony in groups, it has to include crisis. You know, the word for crisis, by the way, and Tian, you're Chinese. I'm told, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, but it is understood that the characters for the term crisis in Chinese is a combination of two words. One is danger and one is opportunity. And she's saying, yes, it's true. That crisis, it means danger and opportunity together. And crisis is a huge opportunity if we take advantage of it. But it's not opportunity unless we take advantage of it. And so what what I've tried to suggest here is a way to take advantage of crisis in groups, because crises happen. Crises are how we grow. I mean, one way of maturation is to understand it's working through a series of developmental crises over the course of our lives. That's what maturation involves. So achieving real harmony in groups is I believe, a primary means. And that's what Baba wanted us to be in groups. Why did he want us to be in groups? To do his work, to spread his message, to learn about his life and message. But I think especially to learn to live in harmony and to learn the lessons that come from living in harmony. So I want to end this with just going back to Baba's quote about this. Baba said, "I do not mind crises. I do not mind chaos, but I do mind disharmony. I tolerate everything. Be tolerant with everyone. And when you feel like rising up in a fury and having an argument with your adversary, say, I'm here for Baba. And Baba wants, above all else, harmony. Harmony is the basis of life. Living in a group, working for and living with me and helping me in my work." Jai Baba.